The auction block in Coldwater Ridge wasn't much, 3 planks nailed over a whiskey barrel, set up outside the bank on a morning so cold the horse's breath hung in the air like smoke. But the crowd pressed in close that day, tighter than Sunday service, because word had gone around that Ezra Dunmore's girl was going to be sold off to cover her dead father's debts. Verity Dunmore stood on that platform in her mother's Goodwill coat, the only decent thing she owned, and she did not cry. She'd promised herself that much. Her hands were folded in front of her, knuckles white, and she stared at a point somewhere past the crowd, past the mountains, like if she looked hard enough she could will herself into some other life. Standing at the edge of the gathering, half in shadow under the feed store awning, Cormac Wilder watched her with his jaw set tight enough to crack a tooth. He hadn't planned on coming to town that day. He'd only ridden in for nails and rope. But he'd heard the murmur outside the saloon, "They're selling the Dunmore girl to Grady," and something in him had gone cold and still, the way a man goes quiet right before a fight. Silas Grady stood near the front, thumbs hooked in his vest, grinning like a man who already owned the deed to the world. He held the note on the Dunmore ranch, $400, more money than most men in that county saw in 2 years, and everybody knew what he intended to do with a wife who had nowhere else to go. The auctioneer, a nervous little man named Pruitt, cleared his throat and started the bidding low, like it embarrassed him to be doing it at all. "Now, Miss Dunmore's hand comes with a paid note and 160 acres of good grazing land." "Do I hear, $50, Grady said, before Pruitt even finished. Nobody bid against him. Nobody dared. Grady owned half the town's paper and most of its silence. Verity's chin lifted a fraction, the only sign she gave that she'd heard him at all. Cormac watched that small movement and felt something crack open in his chest, old and rusted shut for 3 years. He thought of his wife, buried up on the ridge behind his cabin. He thought of the promise he'd made himself the day he buried her, that he was done with loving anybody, done with the particular cruelty of caring what happened to another living soul. Then he thought about walking away and letting that girl go home with Silas Grady. "Going once," Pruitt said, sounding sick about it. Cormac stepped out from under the awning. The crowd parted like water around a stone. "I'll take her," he said. The words came out rough, unpracticed, louder than he meant them. The whole street went dead quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Grady turned slow, like a man who couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Wilder? You ain't bid a dime in your life. You got $400 burning a hole somewhere I don't know about." "I've got it," Cormac said, and he did, every cent he'd saved for a new roof, for winter feed, for a future he hadn't let himself imagine in a long time. He'd spend it all right there in the street if that's what it took. Verity's eyes finally left that far-off point on the horizon and found him. There was no gratitude in her face, not yet, just a kind of stunned, wary disbelief, the look of a woman who'd learned the hard way that kindness usually came with a price tag stitched inside it. Pruitt looked between them, then at Grady's thunderous face, then shrugged like a man who wanted no more part of this than he already had. "Sold," he said, to Cormac Wilder. Nobody in Coldwater Ridge could explain it. Cormac Wilder had spent 3 years as the loneliest man in the county, a widower who kept to his ranch, spoke only when spoken to, and had turned down 2 respectable widows who'd come courting with pie and good intentions. Now here he was, standing in the street with his hat crushed in his hands, having just spent his life's savings on a wife he'd exchanged maybe a dozen words with in his whole life. He'd known Verity Dunmore the way a man knows the far side of a mountain, by shape, not by walking it. Her father had farmed 2 ridges over. Good land, bad luck. A wagon accident had taken her mother when Verity was 12. Fever had taken her father last winter, along with any hope of paying off what he owed Grady's bank. Cormac remembered, dimly, seeing her at her father's funeral, a girl standing straight-backed in the rain, refusing the umbrella somebody offered her, like she needed the cold to feel something real. He recognized that kind of grief. He'd worn it himself. They rode back to his ranch that afternoon in a wagon that felt longer than any road he'd ever traveled, the silence between them thick enough to cut. Verity sat with her carpetbag on her lap like a shield, staring straight ahead. "You didn't have to do that," she said finally, when the town was well behind them. "I know." "Then why?" Cormac worked the reins in his hands, choosing his words the way a man chooses his footing on loose rock. "Didn't seem right, letting Grady have you. That's all." "That's all," she repeated, like she didn't believe him, and maybe she was right not to. It wasn't all. It wasn't close to all. But he didn't have better words for the thing that had moved him, some old, buried decency that had cracked open when he'd seen her standing on that platform like she'd already given up on being rescued. They reached the cabin as the sun dropped low and orange behind the ridge. It wasn't much, 2 rooms, a good stone chimney, a barn he'd built with his own hands the summer after he lost Eliza. Verity looked at it the way a person looks at a place they're not sure they're allowed to want. "There's a room in back," Cormac said, unloading her single trunk. "Was going to be a nursery, once. It's empty now. Yours, if you want it." She didn't answer, just carried her bag inside without looking at him, and Cormac stood in the yard a long moment, listening to the door shut behind her, wondering what exactly he'd done and whether he had the first idea how to do it right. That night he slept in the barn loft, on a bed of old hay and horse blankets, and told himself it was because a gentleman didn't crowd a woman in her own house, even a house he'd built, even a marriage he'd bought like a length of rope. He didn't sleep much. He kept thinking about her face on that platform, the stillness of it, and wondering what kind of storm was working underneath. The work of the ranch didn't care about anybody's feelings, and that turned out to be a mercy. There were chickens to feed, a milk cow that hated everybody equally, fences down from the last hard freeze. Verity rose before dawn the first morning and was already at the stove when Cormac came down from the loft, and neither of them said much of anything, but she'd made coffee strong enough to strip paint, and he drank 2 cups without complaint, and something about that small, wordless exchange felt like the first true thing between them. She worked like a woman who needed the work, hard, fast, unsparing of herself. Cormac noticed the calluses on her hands within the first week, noticed she didn't flinch from the ugly jobs, mucking stalls or wringing a chicken's neck for supper. She was tougher than her small frame let on, and he found himself watching her out of the corner of his eye more than he meant to, the way she squared her shoulders before lifting something heavy, like she refused to let the world see her strain. They fell into a rhythm without ever discussing it. Mornings, she in the kitchen, him in the barn. Middays, mending fence together in a silence that slowly, carefully, stopped being uncomfortable. Evenings, a meal eaten across a small table, words passed back and forth like careful currency, weather, the price of grain, whether the roof would hold through another storm. It was on the 9th day that the real conversation happened, out at the fence line, both of them wrestling a post back into frozen ground. "You lost somebody," Verity said, not looking at him, working the post with both hands. "I can tell. You've got the same look my father had, after my mother passed." Cormac stopped, breathing hard from the cold and the labor. "My wife. Eliza. 3 years back. Fever took her in a week. I'm sorry. I don't talk about her much." "I noticed." Verity finally looked at him, and there was something almost gentle in it, an understanding that didn't need explaining. "You don't have to. I just wanted you to know I could see it. Some things don't need saying to be understood." Cormac felt that sentence land somewhere deep and unguarded in his chest. Nobody had said anything like that to him in 3 years. Most folks either avoided the subject entirely or pushed too hard, wanting him to grieve out loud so they could feel better about their own sympathy. Verity did neither. She just let the weight sit there between them, acknowledged, unforced. "Why didn't you fight it?" he asked her, the question he'd been carrying since the auction block. "Grady. The whole business. You just stood there." Verity was quiet a moment, driving the post deeper with the flat of the axe. "Fighting doesn't work when you've got no cards left to play. I learned that with my father's illness. Sometimes the only power you've got left is deciding how you carry yourself while the bad thing happens to you." She looked at him, steady. "I wasn't going to give Grady the satisfaction of watching me break. You didn't break for me either, Cormac said. Standing up there. No, she agreed. But I didn't expect a stranger to hand me back my whole life for the price of a roof repair either. It wasn't quite a smile that crossed her face, but it was close enough that Cormac felt something in his own chest loosen for the first time in longer than he could remember. The trouble came, as trouble does, right when things had started to feel almost peaceful. Grady rode out to the Wilder ranch on a gray afternoon 3 weeks later, flanked by 2 men Cormac didn't recognize and didn't like the look of. He didn't dismount, just sat his horse at the edge of the yard like a man surveying property he intended to reclaim. Wilder, he called out. I come to make you an offer. $450 for the note back on the girl. Cash today. Cormac stepped out of the barn, a hay fork still in his hand, and felt every muscle in his back go tight. Verity had come to the cabin door, wiping flour from her hands, her face gone pale and still in a way that told Cormac she'd expected this day to come eventually, had been bracing for it since the auction. She's my wife, Cormac said. Not a debt to be traded twice. Everything's got a price, Grady said. You bought her for $400. I'm offering you a profit. Get off my land, Grady. Grady's smile didn't move, but something behind his eyes did. You think this ends here? I hold 3 other notes in this county, Wilder. Yours could be one of them, come spring, if the bank decides your loan's due early. Things happen to men who cross me. He turned his horse and rode off without waiting for an answer, his men trailing behind, and the silence he left behind was worse than any threat spoken outright. That night, Verity sat across from Cormac at the table, her supper untouched. I should never have let you buy me, she said quietly. Now you've got Grady's eye on you too. This is my trouble. It shouldn't be yours. It's ours, Cormac said, and he surprised himself with how easily the word came out, how true it felt sitting in his mouth. You're my wife. Whatever comes for you comes for me too. That's not a debt, Verity. That's just what it means, being married to somebody. You didn't marry me because you wanted a wife, she said. You married me because you couldn't stand by and watch a wrong thing happen. Maybe that's how it started. Cormac reached across the table, not quite touching her hand, close enough that she could close the distance if she wanted to. Doesn't mean it's how it's staying. Verity looked at his hand a long moment, and then, slow and careful like she was testing whether the ground would hold, she covered it with her own. Neither of them said anything else that night. They didn't need to. The bank note came due early that spring, just as Grady had promised, and for 3 terrible days it looked like everything Cormac had built, the ranch, the marriage, the fragile new piece of it, might collapse under the weight of Grady's spite. But word travels strange in small counties, and it turned out Cormac Wilder had built more goodwill in 3 years of quiet, decent living than Grady had built in a decade of quiet cruelty. The rancher 2 farms over came with cash to spare. The blacksmith forgave an old debt outright. Pruitt the auctioneer, of all people, rode out with papers proving Grady had inflated the original note against Ezra Dunmore, enough to bring the sheriff's attention down on Grady's books at last. It wasn't a single dramatic moment that saved them. It was a dozen small ones, neighbors quietly deciding that a wrong had gone on long enough. Grady's grip on the county loosened like a fist finally forced open. Cormac and Verity stood together at their fence line the evening it was finally settled, watching the sun go down gold and orange over land that was, for the first time, entirely and only their own. I keep thinking about that day on the platform, Verity said. I told myself I'd survive it, whatever happened. I didn't let myself hope for anything better than survival. And now? She turned to him, and this time the smile reached all the way to her eyes. Now I think survival was just the beginning of it. Cormac took her hand, rough palm against rough palm, 2 people who'd both learned the hard way what it cost to lose someone, and what it meant to be handed a second chance neither of them had thought to ask for. I didn't buy you that day, he said. I want you to know that. Whatever it looked like to the town, I wasn't buying anything. I was just refusing to let something good get thrown away. I know that now, Verity said. Took me a while. But I know it. They stood there a long while as the light faded, not saying much else, because by then they'd learned the same lesson Verity had tried to teach him that first week at the fence line: some things don't need saying to be understood. Folks in Coldwater Ridge still talk about the day Cormac Wilder stood up in the street and said two words that changed everything. Some call it foolish. Some call it the bravest thing anyone in that town ever witnessed. But those who knew Cormac and Verity in the years after, who watched that ranch grow, who saw two grieving, guarded people slowly become each other's whole world, they'll tell you it wasn't really about the money he spent that morning. It was about a man who'd promised himself he was done caring for anybody, choosing to care anyway, because the alternative was watching someone he barely knew get swallowed up by a world that had already taken too much from her. Maybe that's the real lesson in all of it. Love doesn't always arrive the way we expect. Sometimes it starts as a debt paid on a cold morning, a decision made in a heartbeat, before either heart involved has any idea what it's agreeing to. If this story moved you even a little, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button, because we've got more stories like Cormac and Verity's waiting for you, stories about the kind of quiet courage that built the West, one hard choice at a time. And if you've ever had a moment in your own life where you chose to do the right thing even when it cost you everything, tell us about it in the comments below. We'd love to hear it.